This video piggybacks off my last upload about the shirt I created during my time studying at Parsons Paris. If you want to see more about the initial research and what actually went into creating this look, go give that video a watch. Otherwise, this video will focus more on specific sewing and leatherwork techniques used to actually create the bow bag. Keeping with the office motifs, I decided to fuse a bow with a briefcase. This is achieved through the leather panel on the front that gathers and tucks into the strap along the center, buckling it all into place. Right below this latch is a small leather loop that a longer strip gets threaded through, meant to resemble the wispy tails of a bow. When we open up this latch and look beneath the panel, there's a hidden front zipper pocket tucked inside here. On the sides, there are two small strap rings on the gusset that originally were meant to be used in tandem with this extra strap so you could wear it around your shoulder. I didn't end up finishing that idea out on the fabrication for this one, but I don't necessarily think it detracted from the look in any major way. The handles connect to the shell through 4 small square rings and have a piece of rope sewn along the inside to support the round shape and make them a little more comfortable to hold on to. On the bottom of the bag, there are also 4 little metal feet that make it rest a little easier when it's placed on the ground. Moving inside the bag through a single zipper that runs along the main gusset, there's a black nylon taffeta lining with 1 additional leather window zipper pocket. Working off the same mood board I showed in my last video, the bag's design process actually began after the shirt had started to take its form, so the motif of the bow was at the front of my mind. My first few sketches attempted this integration in a variety of ways. Some sketches focused more on fusing bows directly onto the bag like a kind of decoration. I was also experimenting with different styles of briefcases at this point to figure out which functional aspects could lend themselves nicely to my bow idea. One of the bigger differences in style came from the handle and closure method. I liked the front latch of a top frame, but I wanted the double handle style and zipper hardware of a top zip. As I continued to sketch, the bag began to take the approach of fully transforming the archetype to morph into the bow itself. Eventually, I landed on a design somewhere in between these two approaches, with the bow itself iterating into the bag's pattern, which also blended the top zip and top frame construction techniques. This hybrid approach resulted in a more balanced final product that didn't lean too much into the basic archetype, but also didn't fall victim to becoming too experimental. I wanted to keep the core functionality and wearability of the piece as a fundamental aspect of its design, not simply an afterthought or a convenient bonus. Just like when sewing clothes, deciding on a leather is sometimes a more important first step than things like patterning or toiling. The leather I picked up for this look was a roughly 30 square foot hide of dead stock Echo leather. I got it at La Réserve des Arts,
La Réserve des Arts,
which is a really cool recycled art and material warehouse a little outside of Paris. They had all kinds of cool dead stock materials for super cheap, including tons of zippers, hardware, fabrics, and of course, leathers. One of the coolest things I snagged from here were these gunmetal green tape Balenciaga zippers. I have no clue what I'm going to use them for, but at the moment they make for some pretty cool wall decor. I bought the hide for around €65, but this was actually before I had fully realized my final design, so I took a risk to get everything I would need in one go, mostly because the shop was a bit of a hike away from where I normally commute, and carrying a bunch of heavy materials on the metro is not fun. That approach overall worked out fine this time, but could have been a big waste of money if my design ended up calling for a completely different kind of leather or color. That being said, my choice of leather didn't come without some challenges. I had concerns about using this hide for the briefcase, mostly because it was somewhat thin, more flexible, and most importantly, had quite a bit of stretch. I figured that a stiffer leather that would hold its shape would probably make for a better outcome, but decided to go with what I had, and funny enough, my concerns about the stretch actually didn't prove to be too much of an issue, but my concerns about the structure definitely were. If I had to make this bag again, I would probably glue a larger piece of stiffer leather or canvas on the inside of the main shell to reinforce each panel, which I imagine would also help reduce on the pulling that's coming from the corners up here. The pattern making process was actually super simple and reminded me a lot of earlier projects I did at my last school that involved making 3D shapes out of foam core. Unlike more wearable garment patterns that rely more on complex curves, balance lines, and heavy contouring, bag patterns are almost always just a bunch of curvy squares and rectangles, which makes them really good starter pattern making projects. I got a lot of the measurements for the shell from this briefcase, which had its dimensions on its website. A quick note on this. Taking measurements of core parts of garment archetypes when you're drafting patterns is a great way to skip a lot of the guesswork involved in making clothes. You're already going to be working really hard to translate and deconstruct your designs into pattern pieces, so there's no reason to make things more difficult by starting from scratch, and it saves you a toile's worth of adjustments. Measuring directly on your reference garments or accessories is a practice I would highly recommend. For clothes, I would think of areas like the waistband width, fly length, hem widths, and pocket lengths. Pattern making is hard work, and there's no reason to make it more complicated for yourself by starting from scratch. Integrating my design into the pattern started really with the bow piece on the front. It's essentially a clone of the front and back pattern, except I extended the width by a few extra centimeters. This helps prevent the gathering happening in the middle from pulling along the sides too much, which also makes it easier for the bag to remain in shape. I also shifted these top and bottom edges in a little bit so that it would be a smoother transition out from where it attaches to the gusset. Looking at it now, I do wish that I smoothed these out a little more to be rounder instead of this sharp corner. One of the areas I was most concerned about when sewing everything together were these corners where all 3 layers of leather would be stitched together, and also along this spot on the gusset that would be as thick as 5 layers. In this case, getting your pieces skived is standard practice. Skiving leather is when you take either a really sharp blade or specialized machine to wear away at some of the material on the edge of leather in a kind of slope shape, which in turn makes that edge thinner and easier to stitch and then turn inside out. In my case, I ended up going to an atelier that could use her specialized machines to get a perfect edge every time, and it was only like $10. This did a lot to help with areas like this, and overall made my seams much cleaner. When it comes to making bag handles, normally the stiffener in the middle would be some kind of clear piece of PVC piping that gets sewn inside, then snipped off and sits invisibly inside the handles. I couldn't find anything like this at my local hardware store in Paris, but the closest thing I could find was rope. It was about the same diameter and would also be flexible enough to account for the curve. Editing aid in here. I wanted to clarify that I make it sound like the standard practice for bag handles is the plastic tubing and that rope is some kind of like backup option. After doing a little more research, rope is used a lot for rolled handles, and so is leather cording. Plastic PVC tubing actually seems to be the less common option out of the 3, so I don't really know where I got the idea that that was like the default. That's all. On with the video. It actually ended up working out pretty well, but because it was a normal beige twine color with white nylon in the middle, I dipped each end in black paint to hide them a little better where they would be visible on the underside of the handle. Something my professor taught us that I had never seen before was this method of manually backstitching leather. It seemed kind of overkill to me at first, but now is one of my favorite parts of leatherworking. When top stitching leather in any area that has a visible beginning and end, for example, the handles and strap, make sure to pull out a generous tail of thread before you begin sewing. Position your needle in place and begin stitching, making sure not to use your machine to backstitch.
No.
When you arrive back to where you started, carefully stitch one last loop just before your initial starting point and pull your material out, again, leaving a long thread tail. Then snip. Back at your workspace, retrim your thread edges so they're nice and sharp. Then put them through the eye of a regular hand sewing needle. Now you can weave the threads in and out of the existing holes made by the machine in order to do a fully manual backstitch. I usually go about 2 stitches in each direction just to be safe. The real magic of this technique is the way that we finish the thread. When you're done backstitching, carefully poke the needle out through the middle of both leather layers so that the thread is coming out of the side seam. Hold your thread tight and use the sharp tip of a soldering iron to carefully melt off the remaining thread. There are also specialized leather burnishing irons that do this same thing, but I'm personally using a $10 soldering iron from Amazon, and having used both, the working experience and the results are both pretty much the same. So in this case, don't be worried that using a cheaper tool is going to give you a cheaper looking result. This process will hide your thread edge nice and smoothly while also keeping it held in place from the melting process. If you plan to burnish and/or paint this edge, ensure you do this step first. Then, any remaining artifacts of the burnt thread will disappear, leaving a flawless seam. Wrapping things up here inside the bag, the lining was basically the exact same pattern as the outside shell, but with a subtle zipper pocket covered in a leather window, common on handbag pockets that attach to lining fabric. In order to sew the lining and shell together to close out the bag, I connected both top gusset pieces by the zipper, then sewed the remainder of each shell to its respective side. When that was complete, I unpicked part of the inside lining in order to turn everything inside out. If you've ever sewn a jacket with a lining, this is very similar to how we reverse everything and close it off through one of the internal arm lining seams. Once everything was in place, I top stitched the open part of the lining close, which finishes off the sewing for the bag, only leaving a subtle edge on the lining that's barely noticeable. This was a really fun bag to make, and I actually plan to digitize and upload the pattern to my Patreon for like $1. I think it would be fun to make another video in the future that actually goes over each individual step of making the bag, so if that is something that is of interest to you guys, please let me know. Even though the design may appear a little complex, it's actually a relatively simple project, especially if you have past sewing experience. I also felt a bit sentimental about my time studying at CCS in Detroit, because when I first arrived, they had not begun their apparel design program yet, and so everyone around me was working exclusively on shoes and handbags, which inspired me to try my hand at bag making for some of my first sewing projects long before I ever gave apparel design a try. Looking at these earlier projects is fun, but does make me cringe a little bit, specifically when I'm looking at my seaming and especially how I would attach zippers. I still had a lot to learn, but I enjoyed the process a lot and made some fun designs that focused less on technicality and more about just exploring my ideas and inspirations. I really hope that videos like these are helpful in showing what the design process can look like for different people. I also think there's a ton of crossover in art and design where you can improve in one area of your craft by focusing on a completely different thing. Thank you guys so much for watching, and please let me know what you want to see from me next. Okay, bye!